one bitterly cold January night. I travelled down from London to see my old friend, who was by then well into his 80s, with a mind as sharp as ever, but crippled by severe arthritis. He was one of a dying breed of Cambridge bachelors, for whom his college was his family. He'd lived in this handsome set for over 50 years, and he would be content to die here. But I shouldn't like to give the impression that this was a sympathy visit to an old man. Theo was tremendous company, witty, acerbic, fond of stories. Even the youngest undergraduates had always vied to sit next to him in hall. It was the last week of the vacation, and the college was quiet. We'd eaten a good dinner, drunk a bottle of good claret, and were stretched out comfortably in our chairs before a good fire. But the winter wind howled off the fens, and occasionally a burst of hail rattled against the glass. For a few moments I'd fancied Theo was dozing, but then he said, "I wondered if you'd care to hear a strange story." "Very much." As I glanced across at him, I was startled to see that his face, caught in the flicker of firelight, was deathly serious. "Make of it what you will, Oliver, but I assure you this story's true. Before I begin, could I trouble you to fetch the whisky decanter?" As I went to the shelf of drinks, Theo said, "My story concerns the picture to your left." He was indicating a shadowy strip of wall between two bookcases. Theo had always been known as something of a shrewd art collector, with some quite valuable paintings he'd picked up for modest sums when he was a young man. "Switch on the lamp." The oil painting was of a Venetian carnival scene. On a landing stage beside the Grand Canal, and in the square behind it, a crowd in masks and cloaks milled around among jugglers, tumblers and musicians. More people were climbing into gondolas. The picture was typical of those whose scenes are lit by flares and torches, which throw an uncanny glow here and there, illuminating faces and patches of bright clothing, and leaving other parts in deep shadow. I switched off the lamp, and the picture, with its slightly sinister revellers, retreated into its corner of darkness. "Have you had it long?" "Longer than I've had the right to it." Theo leaned back into his deep chair, so that he too was now in shadow. "It'll be a relief to tell someone. It's been a burden. Perhaps you wouldn't mind taking a share of the load." Of course, I didn't hesitate, never imagining what taking a share of the load would cost me. And so he began his story. "You know how as a young man I used to enjoy buying and selling pictures? Well, one Easter vacation I went to London to work in the reading room of the British Museum and do some picture dealing. On this particular day there was an auction, and from the catalogue I'd picked out a couple of old master drawings and one major painting, which I particularly wanted to see. The old masters weren't, in fact, as good as they were made out, and I didn't want to bid, but I saw a couple of watercolours which I knew I could sell on. Then, wandering round the sale room, I spotted the Venetian oil. It was in poor condition, and the frame was chipped. It wasn't indeed the sort of picture I generally liked, but there was a strange, almost hallucinatory quality about it. It seemed to draw me into itself, so that I felt a part of the night-time scene, one of the crowd of masked revellers. I stood in front of it for a long time, peering into every nook and cranny of the palazzos, and when I went away from it, it drew me back several times. I knew, of course, that I had to buy it. When the bidding started, the pictures I had first come for went quickly beyond my means, but I secured a small group of seascapes and then sat through one stodgy sporting oil after another. I almost dozed off. But as the sale was petering out, there was the Venetian carnival scene, looking dark and unattractive now it was out in the open. There were a couple of half-hearted bids, and then a pause. I raised my hand, No one took me on. Then, just as the hammer came down, there was a slight flurry behind me, and a voice called out, but the auctioneer took the view that it was after the hammer, and there was an end. The Venetian oil was mine for a very modest sum. The palms of my hands were damp, and my heart was pounding. I've never felt such an anxiety to obtain anything. Why did I want the picture so badly? What was its hold over me? As I went towards the cashier's office, someone tapped me on the shoulder. A stout, sweating man carrying a large leather portfolio said, "Mister, I need to speak with you urgently. Is there somewhere we can go so as not to be overheard?" He was glancing around as if he expected a dozen eavesdroppers to be closing in on us, and I felt annoyed. I didn't know the man and had no wish to scurry off with him to some corner, and I was keen to get to the cashier's office before a queue developed. I made to move away, but he grabbed me by the arm. "I'm acting on behalf of a client. I should have been here far earlier, but I was delayed. I have to acquire the picture. It's absolutely vital that I take it back with me." "But you were too late," I said. The man took out a large handkerchief and wiped his brow, but the beads of sweat popped up again at once. "The Venetian picture," he said. His breath fetid in my face. "You obtained it, and I must have it. My client's wealthy. I'll pay what you ask. It's in your interests, after all. You'd only sell it on." I wrenched my arm from his grip. "The picture is not for sale." Without troubling about good manners, I turned on my heel and walked away from him. But he was there again, pawing at me. "My client gave me instructions. I was not to go back without the picture. It's taken years to track it down." We'd reached the cashier's office, where there was, of course, now a considerable queue. "For the last time, leave me alone. I've told you. I want the picture. I bought it, and I intend to keep it." He took a step back, and for a moment I thought that was that. But then he leaned close to me and said, "You'll regret it. I have to warn you. You won't want to keep that picture." It was all I could do not to laugh in his face, but I merely shook my head and turned to stare at the grey cloth of the jacket of the man in front, as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. By the time I left the cashier's window, the man was nowhere to be seen. As I went out into the sunshine of St. James's, I dismissed the incident from my mind. It was only later that evening, as I was settling down to work at my desk, that I felt a sudden chill down my spine. By the time I returned to Cambridge, the summer term was in full swing. When it came to hanging the new pictures, I placed the seascapes with ease. But in spite of the fact that I had it cleaned and restored, wherever I put the Venetian picture, it looked wrong. And about one thing I was adamant. Though I am not a superstitious man, I didn't want it in the room where I slept. In the end, I left the painting propped up against the bookcase, and I couldn't stop looking at it. Every time I came back into these rooms, it drew me to it. However, I didn't hear any more from the tiresome pest in the sale rooms and gradually forgot about him entirely. Just one curious thing happened around that time. During the first week of the Michaelmas term, I was working at my desk when I happened to glance up for a second. The Venetian painting was directly in my sight, and something about it made me shudder. Cleaning had revealed fresh depths to the picture, and I could see far more people crowded on the path, and the gondolas laden with revellers on the water. I'd studied the faces over and over again, and each time I found more. But now, in the circle of lamplight by my desk, it was only one figure which caught my eye. He stood out from all the rest, and though he was near the front of the picture, I didn't think I'd noticed him before. He wasn't looking at the lagoon or the boats, but rather away from them. He seemed, in fact, to be looking at me. He wore clothes of the day, but plain ones, not the elaborate fancy dress of the carnival goers, and he wasn't masked. But two of the revellers close to him wore masks, and both appeared to have their hands upon him, one on his shoulder, the other on his left wrist. His expression was both astonished and afraid. He was looking at me with what I can only describe as pleading. But for what? Whatever the reason, his expression distressed me, and I couldn't concentrate on my work. That night I woke several times, and once out of a strange dream in which the man in the picture was drowning in the canal and stretching out his arms for me to save him. So vivid was the dream that I got out of bed and came in here, switched on the lamp and looked at the picture. Of course, nothing had changed. The man wasn't drowning, though he still looked at me, still pleaded, and I felt that he'd been depicted trying to get away from the two men who had their hands on him. And that, for a very long time, was that. Nothing more happened. I didn't dream about the picture again. But it never lessened its hold on me, as if the ghosts of all those people in that weirdly lit, artificial scene were present with me, forever in the room. Some years later, an old friend came to visit me, and when he saw the Venetian oil, he peered at it closely. "When do you suppose this was painted, Theo?" "It's difficult to date precisely, but 1810 or thereabouts." He shook his head. "Then I can't make it out. You see that fellow there?" He pointed to one of the figures in the nearest gondola. I know him. That's to say, it's the absolute likeness of someone I knew well. Of course, it can't be him. But everything, the way he holds his head, the expression, it's quite uncanny. After that, there was no further incident with the painting, and after a while I put my friend's comments to the back of my mind. Perhaps if I hadn't been the subject of a magazine article, the story, such as it was, would have petered out. I completed my long work on Chaucer, and my publisher had arranged for me to do some interviews. One of the interviewers brought a photographer, and he took several pictures of me in these rooms. In the photograph they used, I was standing by the Venetian picture. I waited for Theo to go on, but he closed his eyes and sat quite motionless. I realized that the evening had exhausted him. It was a clear, frosty night, with the sky brilliant with stars, as I left my tutor's room. The court was deserted, and there were only one or two lights shining out from sets here and there. Though it was nearly midnight, I decided to go for a stroll. The night porter was installed in his lodge with a fire in the grate, and a great brown pot of tea. "You mind your steps, sir? The pavements have a rime on them even now." I thanked him and went out through the great gate. The solitary policeman on the beat nodded to me as I passed him in Bennett Street and made my way through the back lanes. Quite without warning, a sense of oppression came over me like a wave of fever. I glanced round, but the lane was empty. I'm not given to premonitions. The only thing in my mind was Theo Parmiter's strange story. But why should that make me, who had merely sat by the fire listening to it, shudder with fear? I decided to return to my rooms and turn sharply. There must have been a patch of frost, for my feet slithered from under me and I fell heavily. As I lay winded and shaken, I heard from a little distance away to my left a cry and a couple of low voices. Then I heard the sound of a scuffle and another cry. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the backs. and yet to be not away from me at all, but here, at my hand. If what I'd heard was someone being set upon in the dark, then I should get up and go to the victim's aid, or to the policeman I'd seen a few minutes before. I pulled myself to my feet and looked quickly round, but there was no one about and no sound of footsteps. Had I imagined the noises? No. In a quiet street on a still and frosty night, when every sound carries, I couldn't have mistaken what I heard for wind in the trees. I went back to the main thoroughfares and caught sight of the policeman again, trying the door handles of shops to check they were secure. If I'd heard voices, then he, only a few yards away, must surely have heard them too. And yet he was giving no sign of rushing away to an incident. A car turned down from the direction of Trinity Street and glided past me. A cat streaked away into the dark slit between buildings. There was nothing untoward, and the town was settled for the night. I was puzzled. But the dread that had enshrouded me a few minutes earlier lifted, though I was now thoroughly chilled. So I made my way briskly back to the college gate. The porter wished me good night as I turned into the court. All was quiet, but light shone from one of the same 2 windows I'd noticed when I went out, and now from another, on the far left-hand row. Someone must just have returned. I glanced up automatically. What I saw made my blood freeze. Whereas before there'd been a blank window, now a figure was in the room. The lamp was to one side of him, and the light thrown onto his face gave an effect startlingly like that of the Venetian picture. But it was the face itself by which I was transfixed. The man was looking directly at me, and I could have sworn I recognized him, not from life, but from the picture. I particularly noticed his face because the expression was a fine depiction of decadence, of greed and depravity, of malice and loathing, of every sort of inhuman feeling and intent. The eyes were piercing and intense, the mouth full and sardonic, the whole face set into a sneer of arrogance and concupiscence. It was a mesmerizingly unpleasant face, and it had repelled me in the picture, as it horrified me now. I glanced away, shocked, from the window, and when I looked up again, the face had gone. After another couple of seconds, the light went out, and the room was black. The sense of imminent doom had returned, and seemed to wrap me round in place of my coat. But I was determined not to let these feelings get the better of me, and I went across the court and up the staircase of the rooms from which the light had been shining. I stood outside the door and listened closely. There was a silence so absolute that it was uncanny. After a moment I knocked on the outer door. Then I knocked again, more loudly, and when again there was no answer, I turned the door handle and stepped inside the tiny outer lobby. The air was bitterly cold, which was strange, as no one would be occupying rooms on such a night without having heated them. I went into the study. "Hello?" I said. There was no response. I felt along the wall for the light switch. The room was empty. And not only empty of any person, but empty of anything, apart from a desk and chair and a bookcase without any books in it. There was an overhead light, but no lamp of any kind. I went through to the bedroom. There was a bed, stripped of all linen. Nothing else. I couldn't possibly have seen a lamp lit and a figure in this window. But I knew that I had. I went, thoroughly shaken now, down the staircase and across the court to the guest set in which I was staying. I poured myself a large slug of whisky, and went to bed and lay shivering for some time before falling into a heavy sleep. It was filled with the most appalling nightmares, through which I tossed and turned and sweated in horror. Nightmares filled with strange, flaring lights and fires, and the shouts of people drowning. I woke, hearing myself cry out, and as I woke I heard a tremendous crash, followed by a distant and muffled cry. My heart was pounding so loudly that it took me a moment to separate nightmare from reality. But when I'd been sitting upright with the lamp switched on for a few moments, I knew that what I'd seen and the voices of the people drowning had been unreal, but that the crashing sound and the subsequent cry most certainly had not. Everything was quiet now, but I got out of bed and went into the sitting room. All was in order. I went out onto the staircase, but here too everything was still and silent. "Is anyone there? Is everything all right?" I called. But there was no answering call. So I went back to bed and slept fitfully until morning. When I looked out of the windows a little after 8, I saw that a light snow had fallen, and the fountain in the centre of the court had frozen solid. I was dressing when there was a hurried knock on the outer door, and the college servant came in looking troubled. "I thought you'd want to know at once, sir. There's been an accident. It's Mr. Parmiter." The servant had managed to get Theo into his chair in the sitting room where I found him, looking pale with an odd look about his eyes, which I couldn't read. "There's really no need to trouble a doctor." "Well, he's already on his way, so there's an end." I nodded approvingly at the servant who had brought in a tray of tea. "Now, tell me what happened." Theo leaned back and sighed, but I could tell that he wasn't going to argue further. I'd already noticed that the Venetian picture was no longer in its former place. As the servant left, I poured us both a cup of tea. As Theo took his cup, his hand was shaking. "I didn't sleep well," he said. "It's my own fault. I should never have started on that wretched story. I was in such discomfort, I knew I'd be better off sitting in this chair. I heard the clock strike 4 as I made my way in here. When I came up to that wall on which the picture hung, something made me hesitate. The wire holding the painting snapped, and the whole thing crashed down, glancing my shoulder. I lost my balance and fell. If I hadn't paused, it would have hit me on the head. The whole incident's shaken me a little. Oliver, if I don't tell you the rest of the story, I fear I shall never sleep well again. Do you have to return to London immediately?" There was a tap on the door. The doctor had arrived. I told Theo I'd see him later that day, if he was up to talking, but that he must on no account disobey any doctor's orders. I should say that I'm by no means a man who jumps readily to outlandish conclusions. I'm a scholar, and have been trained to require evidence, though, as I'm not a lawyer, circumstantial evidence will sometimes satisfy me well enough. I'm also a man of strong nerve and sanguine temperament, so the fact that I'd been disturbed by events is noteworthy. But enough things had happened to both unnerve me, and also to convince me that they were connected, though each one taken alone meant little. Although my reason told me that the falling picture was readily explained, my shadowy sense of foreboding told me otherwise. I spent most of the day in the library, and returned to college in time to dine in hall with half a dozen of the fellows, then returned to Theo's rooms. Theo was looking better. He had a small glass of malt whisky beside him, a good fire and a cheerful face, and he inquired about my day in a perfectly friendly manner. I noticed that the picture had been rehung in its original position, but now it was in full shadow, the lamp turned away and shining on the opposite wall. I thought the change must have been made deliberately. "What point had I reached in the story?" Theo asked. "You just told me about the article in the magazine and the photograph showing you beside the Venetian picture." "Ah, yes. Well, a couple of weeks after the magazine appeared, I received a letter. I have it still." He handed me a stiff ivory-coloured envelope, addressed to him here in college, and postmarked Yorkshire, some 40 years previously. It was written in violet ink, and in an elaborate, old-style hand. Horden by Exby, North Riding of Yorkshire. Dear Dr. Parmiter, I am writing to you on behalf of the Countess of Horden, who has seen the article about your work and wishes to make contact with you in regard to a painting in the room in which you were photographed. The painting, an oil of a Venetian carnival, is of most particular and personal interest to her ladyship. The Countess has asked me to invite you here, as there are matters that she needs most urgently to discuss. Yours and etc., John Thirlby, Secretary. "And did you go?" I asked. "Oh, yes. I went to Yorkshire. I was still a young man and up for an adventure. I went off with a pretty light heart as soon as term ended." Theo leaned forward to pour himself another glass of whisky. He spoke lightly of his jaunt, but a haunted and troubled look had settled on his features. "I don't know what I expected to find. I had no preconceived ideas of the place called Horden, or of this Countess. But if you think mine is a strange story, Oliver—" My old tutor leaned back in his chair and smiled at me. What had I expected to find in Yorkshire? A bleak house set above a ravine with ivy clinging to damp walls. The house was certainly isolated, but I was greeted by a pleasant-faced butler who introduced himself as Stevens and took me to a splendid room in which I found everything I could have wanted to pass a comfortable night. "Her ladyship would like you to join her in the blue drawing-room at 7:30, sir." "Does the Countess dress for dinner?" "Oh, yes, sir." The wide corridor to the drawing-room was lined with oil paintings. Stevens led me along too quickly for me to do more than glance from side to side, but my spirits lifted at the thought of what treasures there must be in the house. "Dr. Parmiter, milady." There was nothing dilapidated or chilling about the drawing-room. It was extremely grand, with a magnificent fireplace in front of which were 3 large couches. There were lamps on small tables, and at the far end I saw a grand piano. But the woman who sat on an upright chair with her face turned away from the fire didn't match the room in warmth or welcome. She was very old, with parchment-textured skin that resembled the dried flowers of honesty. She wore a long frock of some green material, and there were diamonds around her long, sinewy neck. But her eyes weren't the washed-out eyes of an old woman. They were a piercing, unnerving blue. "Dr. Parmiter, please sit down. Thank you for coming." As I sat, the butler appeared and offered champagne. "This is a splendid house, and you have some wonderful works of art." She waved her hand slightly. "I presume it's a family home of some generations." "It is." The Countess was clearly not one for small talk, and I felt a miasma of gloom descend on me. Then she said, "You cannot know what a shock I received on seeing the picture." "The photograph of the Venetian painting in the magazine? May I ask what importance it holds for you?" "It's of more importance than I can say." Her gaze held mine as a hand might hold another in a grip of steel. But it wasn't until dinner was over that she returned to the subject. She took me to the library, where there was a long polished table on which were set out several albums. The butler helped her to a chair at the table and poured coffee for me. As he left, the Countess motioned for me to sit beside her and opened one of the albums. She turned several pages without explanation, but at last came to a double spread of sepia wedding photographs from half a century ago.
My wedding, Dr. Parmiter. Please look carefully.
I studied the various groups.
Does nothing strike you?
It did not. I looked for a long time, but knew no one, recognized nothing.
Look at my husband.
He was a dark-haired young man, his hair slightly waved at the sides. I confess I recognized no one, save yourself. She turned her eyes on me, and her face wore a curious expression, partly of hauteur, but also of a distress I couldn't fathom.
Please.
I glanced down again, and in that split second had an extraordinary flash of recognition. The shock must have shone clearly on my face, for the Countess said,
"Ah, you see."
I was groping in the dark for a moment. I now knew there was something intimately familiar about her face, not hers, her young husband's. It was as though I knew it so well that it was the face of a member of my own family. I shook my head.
Look.
She handed me the magazine with a photograph of me in my college rooms. For a split second I felt nauseous. How could I believe what I was seeing? The Venetian picture was very clear in the magazine photograph. There was, you remember, one particular scene within the scene. A young man being held by the arm and threatened by another person, on the point of stepping into one of the boats. His head turned to look into the eyes of whoever was viewing the picture, with an expression of desperate terror and of pleading. The face of the young man being persuaded into the boat was the face of the Countess's husband. There was no doubt about it. "My God," I whispered. "So your husband was a sitter for the artist." As I said it, I knew how ridiculous it was.
The picture was painted in the 18th century.
Then this is a relative?
No. It's Lawrence.
The Countess was leaning over the photograph, gazing at the face of her young husband, with an intensity of longing and distress, such as I had never seen.
I met my husband at a ball, and we experienced a coup de foudre. Few people are lucky enough to know love at first sight, to understand its utterly transforming power. He was several years older than me, but that didn't matter. Nothing mattered. My parents looked upon Lawrence with favour. There was only one thing to trouble us. He'd been on the verge of an engagement. He hadn't proposed, but there was an understanding, and the young woman in question was bitterly, bitterly hurt. These things happen, Dr. Parmiter. I had no reason to feel in any way to blame, but of course he felt a great concern for the girl. What usually happens in these cases is that one party suffers from hurt pride and a broken heart, both of which are eventually healed by the arrival of another suitor. In this instance, however, the young woman, whose name was Clarissa Vigo, suffered so greatly that I believe it turned her mind. I hadn't known her prior to this, but I'd been assured that she was a charming, gentle young woman. She became a bitter, angry, tormented one, whose only thought was of how she could obtain revenge. Her parents were so concerned at the change in her that they called in a priest to exorcise her demons, but he gave up in despair. Her desire for retribution became so strong that it possessed her entirely. She set out to destroy, and she succeeded in the most terrible way. To begin with, I was unaware of any of this. Lawrence referred only briefly to her, and of course my time and energies were entirely consumed by our forthcoming marriage. But two things happened in the weeks before our wedding. I received an anonymous letter full of poison against me, against Lawrence. It contained a threat to destroy our future. I was terrified. I'd never known hatred in my happy young life, and here it was, directed at me. But I said nothing and kept it locked in a drawer of my writing desk. Wedding presents began to arrive at my parents' house. I was happily occupied in unpacking them one day when along with the candelabra, a picture arrived. There was a card with it on which was written the name of the painter and a date. 1787. There was also a message to the bride and bridegroom. Let what is begun be completed. It was written in the same hand as the malign letter.
The Countess paused for a moment, her eyes on my face. "The Venetian picture," I said. I saw it in my mind's eye, the masked revellers, the people crowded on the gondolas, the moon reflected in the black waters of the lagoon. And as I recalled it, I realized that I'd sensed all along a malevolence and a power emanated from it, which had to do with something more than the painted scene. And it were bound up with that, too.
I hated the picture from the moment I first saw it. I'd grown up among delightful pictures, charming English pastoral scenes. This was a dark, sinister painting in my eyes. As I looked at the faces of those people, at the eyes behind the masks, I felt afraid. But when Lawrence saw the picture, he had nothing but praise for it. When he asked me who'd sent it, I said I'd muddled the card with others in so much unwrapping. I certainly couldn't have expressed any of my feelings about the picture. They were so odd, so unlike anything I'd ever experienced, and I'd have been afraid of being ridiculed. 2 secrets. Not a good way to begin a marriage, you may feel. It wasn't until a day or two before our wedding that I understood who'd sent both the letter and the picture, and that only when I chanced to see an envelope addressed to Lawrence in the same handwriting. I asked him who'd sent it, and he told me that it was from the young woman he might have married. I remember his tone of voice, as if he were holding something back from me. Our wedding was a happy occasion, of course. Only one person in the world wasn't happy for us, but naturally she wasn't there. And on that day, no one could have been further from our minds. And so we began our married life. 6 weeks after the wedding, Lawrence's father, the Earl of Horden, died very suddenly. Lawrence was the eldest son, and I found myself, not yet 21, the mistress of this large house, and with a husband thrust into the running of a huge estate. My father-in-law had been in the best of health, yet he was found dead at his desk one evening after dinner. A stroke. Of course, we believed the medical men. What reason was there to doubt them?
The Countess leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. Her face had a chalky pallor. When her eyelids lifted, the blue eyes were intense on my face.
I have now to tell you something which I expect you to disbelieve. But first, would you go across to the bureau and look at the framed photograph?
I crossed the room, leaving the Countess, a tiny wraith-like figure in the circle of lamplight round her chair. The bureau was in shadow, so I switched on a lamp. As I did so, I caught my breath. The photograph in a plain silver frame was of a middle-aged man sitting at this same desk. It was a good face, resolute and handsome. But I was transfixed, because I'd seen it before. I'd lived with that face.
"So now you see,"
the Countess said. My throat was dry, and I had to clear it a couple of times before I could answer her. "I can only suppose this is some hoax. The painting can't be of its date." The Countess looked at me with disdain.
"There is no question of a hoax. After my father-in-law's death, Lawrence and his mother were in deep mourning. I was sad, but I had known him so little. I wandered about this great place like a lost soul, trying to find a role for myself. It was on these wanderings that I finally came upon the Venetian picture, propped up on a half-empty bookcase. It seemed to draw me to it. It seemed that every face within it looked into mine. As I approached it, some of the faces disappeared into the shadows, but one face remained. There's a palazzo with 2 lighted windows and a balcony overlooking the Grand Canal. In one of those lighted rooms, looking out as if desperate to escape, there was a man, turned towards me. The face was the face of my father-in-law. It was his exact likeness. save that it wore an expression full of panic, even horror. And I knew that I'd not only never noticed his face in the picture before, but that absolutely and unmistakably it had not been there.
The Countess smiled at me sadly.
I was terrified and bewildered, but with all his new responsibilities, I couldn't bring myself to burden my husband with my fears. I threw myself into my new life and tried to forget about the Venetian painting, though I avoided going down the corridor leading to the small sitting room. Lawrence noticed I was pale, and he said he wanted us to get away. I should have welcomed it, but when he told me we were to visit Venice, I felt as if someone's hand had squeezed my heart so tightly that for a moment I couldn't breathe. Just before we left, we went to dinner at the house of a neighbour. As we were seated, I saw that opposite me was Clarissa Vigo. I don't think I've told you, Dr. Parmiter. She was a remarkably beautiful woman. I sat across the table feeling afraid and inferior. She stared over the silver, challenging me to meet her gaze. When I did, it made me tremble. I've never known such malevolence. Her eyes were filled with loathing and a terrible sort of power. But she didn't speak a word to me. A week later, we left for Venice. I've read that everyone who visits the city falls in love with it. Perhaps I was never going to be happy there because of the painting and what I'd seen, but I was taken aback by how much I hated it. I marvelled at the buildings and canals, but it seemed to be a city of corruption and excess, an artificial place full of darkness and foul odours. I knew that a chasm had opened between Lawrence and myself, for he adored it, said he was never happier. I could only smile and remain silent. And all the time I was in a state of dread. My love for my dear husband had somehow turned to a fearful clinging desire to possess. I didn't want to let him out of my sight. We were to be there for 5 nights, and the blow fell on the 3rd. I took a rest in the afternoon while Lawrence went out. He liked simply to wander in and out of squares and over bridges. He returned, smiling with delight. He'd bumped into friends who had a palazzo on the Grand Canal. The following night there was to be a masked ball. He'd already arranged an appointment with a costumier. Lawrence wanted me to wear silk and lace with an ornate jewelled mask, but I wanted to go as a peasant girl. He hired a great black cloak and tricorn hat, and his mask was covered in mother-of-pearl buttons. He was thrilled, just like a child going off to a party, though by now I was in a fever of dread. It was a hot night. The ballroom of the palazzo was packed with people, and I found it sinister not being able to see faces, but I revived myself by drinking some sparkling wine, and then I danced with Lawrence, and the evening seemed, if not pleasurable, at least less frightening than I'd feared. I was almost enjoying myself when it was announced that we were to parade through the streets, watched by the citizens from their windows and joined by passers-by. Apparently the people expected it. There was a great exodus, and in the confusion I became separated from my husband. As we crowded down the great staircase and streamed outside, the torches flared orange against the night sky. You can see the scene, Dr. Parmiter. The light on the dark water, the waiting gondolas, the crowds, the masks, the eyes gleaming.
I shivered, seeing the Venetian picture before my eyes.
What happened next I can barely believe. You may dismiss it. Any sane person would. We were outside the palazzo on the landing stage. The gondolas were lining up to take us to the Rialto Bridge. I was standing a yard or two from Lawrence when I heard my name called. The strange thing was that it was my maiden name. But who here knew it? I could see no one. Then I glimpsed not a face, but the eyes of someone I recognized. They were the eyes of Clarissa Vigo, looking out from a white silk mask, below a great plume of white and silver feathers. The gondoliers were trying to get me to go on board, but I only wanted to go with Lawrence, so I drew back and started to look for him. But he wasn't on the landing stage, and I was as certain as I could be that he would never have crossed the canal without me. I was frightened now. The woman had disappeared in the crowd, but I'd seen her. I'd heard her whisper my name. I tried to make my way back to the palazzo. Then I heard a commotion behind me, a shout. It was my husband calling me. He was shouting in terror. I pushed back to the landing stage. The last gondola laden with revellers was pulling away. I searched in it in vain for a glimpse of my husband. I ran through the squares like a mad creature, calling Lawrence's name. The main piazza was empty. A beggar lying in an alleyway snarled at me. A dog barked. I ran to our hotel, in a state of frenzy, yet sure there might still be an innocent explanation, that Lawrence would be there, waiting. He wasn't. Lawrence was never found. The police search couldn't have been more thorough, but no one had seen him. No one else had heard his voice that last time. It was concluded that he'd accidentally slipped into the canal and drowned, but his body was never discovered. I returned home to this great barren place. I was in such a state of shock that the doctors feared for my life. But I recovered, slowly. Then I discovered I was expecting a child. In the middle of one night I woke suddenly. Something that had been hovering just out of reach had come cleanly into my mind. I felt ill and afraid, but I had no choice. I took the key from my bureau and made my way slowly down the long, silent corridor to the small sitting room. I switched on the lamp, and as I saw the picture again, I realized that in the mustiness of the room I could smell a hint of something else, sharp and distinctive. Fresh oil paint. The picture was as I'd left it, with its face to the wall. In a single moment of determination I took hold of it and held it to the light. At first it seemed exactly as before, and then I saw, first in one corner, almost hidden in the crowd, the head of someone wearing a white silk mask, with white and silver plumes in the hair, and the eyes of Clarissa Vigo. The same malevolent eyes, but now also with a dreadful gloating in them. I followed their gaze. Standing up at the back of a gondola was a man wearing a black cloak and a tricorn hat. He was between two other heavily masked figures. One had a hand on his arm, the other propelled him forwards. The man had his head turned to me. The expression on his face was one of abject terror and desperate pleading. He was asking to be saved. It was unmistakably a picture of my husband, and the last time I'd seen the Venetian painting it hadn't been there. Of that I was sure. My husband had become someone in a picture painted 200 years before. I touched the canvas with one finger, but it was clean and dry, and I could no longer smell the oil paint that had been so pungent moments before. I couldn't explain what had happened or how, but I knew that an evil force had caused it, and I knew who was responsible. But it made no sense. It still makes no sense.
The Countess looked at me, and I saw years of searching in her eyes, years of bewilderment and despair. Then she said,
"I must have that picture."
"I don't understand," I replied, "how it left your hands and eventually came into mine." Her old face crumpled and her tears came.
"I'm tired,"
she said.
"I don't think I have the strength to tell you any more of this terrible story tonight."
I slept badly. Though my own part in all this was innocent, the Countess's story had disturbed me profoundly. But I felt possessed by an absolute determination to keep the Venetian picture. Why I should want it, I didn't know, but I would neither sell nor give back the painting to the Countess. The following morning, a little after 11, Stevens materialized and told me that coffee and the Countess awaited me in the morning-room. I was glad to see the old lady with rather more colour than the previous evening.
"There's only a little more of my story to tell,"
she said briskly.
"I gave birth to a son, Henry. I adored him. He looked so very like his father. At his coming of age we gave a great party. It would have been a happy occasion, had it not been for the arrival, with a party from another house, of the woman Clarissa Vigo. But one has to be civil. I wasn't going to spoil my only son's most important day, and so far as I was aware, nothing untoward occurred. But I'd reckoned without the powers of evil. On that evening, Clarissa Vigo seduced my son. He was lost to me and to everything else here. He was under her sway, and he married her."
I drew in my breath with surprise.
"I was given a small farmhouse on the farthest side of the estate. This house was barred to me. I didn't see my son. Her reign was absolute. And then the plunder began. Things were removed, sold, thrown away. In the midst of it all, though I didn't know it at the time, the Venetian picture was disposed of. The final tragedy came 5 years later. She and my son went out hunting. In jumping a fence, she fell and was killed outright. The crashing fall disturbed a decayed tree, which came down, killing another horseman and injuring my son. He lived, Dr. Parmiter, paralysed in every limb, for 7 years. He lived to regret bitterly what he'd done, and to ask me to forgive him. I did so without hesitation, and returned here to care for him until he died. And I determined to restore the house to as near the state in which I'd first seen it as I could. I succeeded very well, helped by loyal friends who sought out many items and brought them back here. But one thing I could never trace. The Venetian picture mattered to me because my husband was trapped there. My husband lives within that picture. Then it was spotted in an auctioneer's catalogue. But as you know, my representative was late to the sale. You bought it and wouldn't sell it to him afterwards. That was your privilege. But I was angry, Dr. Parmiter, and distressed and frustrated. Furthermore, the auctioneers wouldn't divulge your name, and we couldn't find any trace of you.
Until you chanced to see my photograph in a magazine.
Indeed. I invited you here, feeling that you had every right to hear the full story. I wanted to bring about a conclusion to this most important business. You may name your price, Dr. Parmiter.
But the picture isn't for sale. I'd be glad for you to visit me in Cambridge to see it at any time to suit you. But I'll never sell. 2 points of bright colour appeared on the old lady's cheekbones. Her face and looked at me with an expression of relief. "Thank you for listening, Oliver. You've done me more good than you may know." I left him and took a turn around the college court, but tonight all was quiet. There were no footsteps, no faces at any lighted windows. I retired with a light heart. But as the chapel clock struck 3, I woke in a state of abject fear, seized with the need to go and check on Theo. All was quiet along the staircase that led to his set. I put my head to the wood and listened intently. There was no sound. But as I turned to go, there was a horrible cry from within, followed by a single loud crash. I pushed my way through the door. Theo was lying on his back. His eyes were wide open and staring, and they had in them a look of such terror, such appalled recognition, that I'll never forget it to my dying day. I knelt down. There was no breath, no pulse. For a second I assumed that the crash was him falling, but then I saw that on the floor, a few yards away from him, lay the Venetian picture. I dreaded what I'd find, but I knew what I must do. I lifted the picture and searched every inch of the canvas. I saw the Countess's young husband and the figure in the white silk mask, but of Theo, thank God, there was no image. I realized that in all probability he'd woken, felt unwell, got up and had his fatal heart attack. When he crashed to the ground, the picture had been disturbed and fallen. Breaking out in a sweat again, but this time of relief, I dialed the night porter. It was a desperately sad few days. The college chapel was packed for his funeral. I left Cambridge with a heavy heart. I had work to get back to, and I had Anne. I'd told Theo a few minutes after my arrival that I was engaged to a beautiful barrister, accomplished, fun, a few years younger than I was. Theo had asked to meet her soon. I told Anne of Theo's death, of course, and the story of the Venetian picture and the old Countess. She listened intently, then smiled and said, "I'm sorry I won't meet your old tutor, for I've a feeling that I'd have liked him. But I can't say I'm sorry not to be meeting the picture. It sounds horrible." "Oh, forget it. It was a story he wanted to tell over a whiskey and a good fire on a cold night. We've more important things to discuss. I have something I want to ask you. Since Theo's death, I don't know why, it somehow seemed very important to me that instead of marrying the following summer, we should marry straight away." To my surprise, Anne was happy to be married quietly, with just family and close friends. The only hesitation I had was when she determined that, as work meant we now couldn't take the long honeymoon in Kenya that we'd planned, we should manage a long weekend away, and suggested we spend it in Venice. But I shook off my forebodings and made the booking. Anne and I were married 2 weeks later, on a day of brilliant sunshine. We had a celebratory lunch with our families, and by late afternoon were en route for Venice. I write what I fear must be the end of this story, to give myself something to do while I wait. I write with such grief and anguish that I can barely hold the pen. I'm sitting in the room of our hotel. The balcony windows are open. From the house opposite I hear a man singing arias from Puccini. How do I explain what happened when there is no explanation? But I can't let this story remain unfinished. For now it's my story, mine and Anne's. We've somehow become a part of this horrible nightmare. We'd been less than 24 hours in the city when Anne discovered there was a festival in honour of one of Venice's hundreds of saints. I said we'd go, but was adamant there'd be no dressing up. I didn't believe in Theo's story, but, though it was irrational, I felt I needed to stay on the side of good luck, not court the bad. The first hour or two were tremendous fun. There were drummers and dancers on every street corner. St. Mark's Square was thronged as the fireworks began over the water, lighting the sky and the ancient buildings. It was spectacular. We walked along the canal, in and out of the alleys, until we came to a jetty crowded with people trying to get gondolas to the opposite bank. I noticed that some of them were wearing the costumes of the carnival. I was suddenly stricken with panic. I wanted to go back to our quiet square and sit at the cafe. I turned to Anne, but she wasn't at my side. I looked to see if she was behind me, and as I turned, the blood stopped in my veins. I glimpsed, a yard or two away, a figure, wearing a white silk mask, and with a white plume of feathers in her dark hair. I caught her eyes, dark and full of hatred. I struggled away from the water, and ran then, calling out to Anne as I searched frantically through all the twists and turns of Venice for my wife. I alerted the police. They said that visitors to Venice get lost every day, especially in a crowd, that until it was daylight they'd little hope of finding her, but that she'd most likely return to our hotel on her own. They told me to wait for her there. But I can't wait, because I saw the woman in the white silk mask, the woman desperate for revenge. I believe in her now. Why she'd want to harm Anne, I have no idea, but she's a destroyer of happiness. One whom even death can't stop, in her desire to haunt and hurt.
It's left to me, Anne, to end this story. Will there be an ending? Oh, there has to be. Such evil surely can't retain its power forever. In the crowd of people on the landing stage, I'd been jostled, and I feared for a child at the edge of the canal. I pulled her away in case she fell in, and almost lost my own balance, but I felt a hand on my arm, helping me to right myself. The unnerving thing was that the hand gripped me so hard it was painful. I caught a glimpse of someone, of a malevolent glance that made me shudder, and saw a hand reach out again towards me. But then I was being taken forward by the crowd, away from the water, and I let myself go with them up onto one of the small bridges over a side canal. A band began to play, and we were all walking together to the music, and I felt myself caught up in the scene. It was exhilarating, with the fireworks still exploding in the night sky. I was laughing and clapping, and soon the Venice I knew was left far behind. Then I slipped on an uneven stretch of pavement and fell. I put my weight on my arm and heard a crack, felt the pain. I let out a cry. People bent over me, jabbering in fast Italian. I was suddenly and violently sick, and the sky whirled, and then it was coming down on my head. There's little else to tell. I was taken into a nearby house, and a doctor was fetched. I hadn't, he decided, broken my arm. I'd bruised it badly. I was bandaged, given painkillers. By now it was 2 a.m. I gave someone the telephone number of the hotel, but the doctor insisted I should lie down and sleep. The next morning I was coaxed into a wheelchair belonging to the grandmother of the family, and trundled through the morning streets of Venice, my bandaged arm resting proudly on my lap, back to our hotel and my husband. Except that Oliver wasn't there. He'd gone out to search for me, distraught. At first, no one reported having seen him, but later that day the police, who'd switched from looking for me to looking for him with some irritation, told me that a gondolier up early to wash out his craft reported having seen a man answering to Oliver's description. He'd been walking between 2 men who had their hands on his arms and seemed to be making him get into a gondola further up the jetty. The Italian police seemed obsessed by theories of kidnap, ransom, or the mafia. But I knew they were far from the mark. I knew. I read the rest of Oliver's story twice. I crawled over it looking for an explanation. A fortnight ago I came back to London alone. Soon after, the Venetian police inspector telephoned me. "Signora, we have revised our opinion. This man the gondoliere saw, we think it is not probable to be your husband after all. Our theory is now he slip and fall into the Grand Canal. The ground is often wet." 2 days ago, I walked from Lincoln's Inn back to our flat. The porter told me that he'd taken in a parcel and put it outside our door. It was with some distress that I saw the envelope addressed to Oliver taped to the outside. The letter was from a firm of solicitors in Cambridge. It enclosed a cheque for £1,000 left to Oliver by his old tutor to buy himself a present. I had to wipe the tears from my eyes before reading on, to learn that the letter came with an item which Dr. Parmiter had left to Oliver in his will. I should have known, of course. I should have taken the whole package unopened down to the incinerator and burnt it. Instead, I simply undid the last of the wrapping paper and looked down at the Venetian picture. And as I did so, I smelt, quite unmistakably, the faintest smell of fresh oil paint. Then I began the frantic search for my husband. He wasn't hard to find. Behind the crowd in their masks, behind the gleaming canal and the rocking gondolas, I saw the dark alley and the backs of two men cloaked in black, their hands gripping a man's arms. The man was turning his head to look back, out beyond the world of the picture, to me, and his expression was one of terror. His eyes were imploring me to rescue him, to get him back. But it was too late. Like the others, he had turned into a picture. It took me a little longer to find the woman, and then it was only the smallest image, almost hidden in one corner, the gleam of white silk, the edge of a white-plumed feather. But she was there. Her arm was outstretched, her finger pointed in Oliver's direction, but her eyes were looking, like his, directly at me, in hideous triumph. I dropped into a chair before my legs gave way. I had only one hope left, that by taking Oliver as she had taken the others, surely to God the woman had satisfied her desire for revenge. Who's left? What more